Bad endings in video games are bad. At least usually they are. When you have a good and a bad ending, it is often the case that the bad one will feel like it's rushed, that it doesn't really fit with the story, that the game wasn't leading up to this conclusion. It's like the developers didn't really want you to see it in the first place, which is a bit contradictory. Of course, this is generally not true for RPGs, since their whole point is to let the player choose what path they want to take, but around 2007 it became a trendy feature in AAA games of all kinds to include at least 2 endings with various degrees of success. Perhaps due to a lack of developing time or due to a lack of real interest in the feature, most often than not, the mechanic was reduced simply to adding an exaggeratedly negative bad ending that reads more as a punishment to the player for having played a certain way than a genuine conclusion. Doing that, you're limiting the concept of a bad ending to exist just as an inherently unsatisfactory consequence, a permanent "you died" screen that won't give you the choice to retry, instead of a viable outcome, hence the existence of few good bad endings. Take for example Bioshock. In Bioshock you will encounter at some point in each level a little girl, often protected by a mini-boss called Big Daddy. Without getting into much detail about how the world of Bioshock works, the point is that you can choose to save this little girl and get some points you can use to get new powers and upgrades, or you can kill her and get a lot more of those points. This is the choice the player has to make, and this is also the only choice that matters towards getting the good or bad ending. Bioshock is a video game heaven of rewarding and encouraging exploration with different builds and powers, meaning player choice, which is why I find it surprising that they chose to punish the player with a bad ending if they make the wrong decision here. There's 21 of these girls, and if you kill a single one of them you will get one of 2 bad endings depending on how many you kill. And yes, killing a weird little girl isn't the most sensible of choices, and in fact I bet almost no one does, but they do seem kinda creepy, and for some people there's no indication that a choice you can make an hour into the game will condemn you to a bad ending straight away. But okay, no one can argue that the player isn't at fault because they made the choice, it was you that killed the girl. The problem here is that the bad ending is awful. The only thing that changes is the ending cutscene, and it sucks, it doesn't fit the vibe of the story at all, the audio is badly mixed in comparison to the good ending, that's how little they cared, and worst of all, like a lot of bad endings, it isn't canon, it's not official, so you are both deprived of a satisfactory conclusion and a valid conclusion itself. Why even are you including an ending to the game if you don't consider it valid, if you're not even gonna put effort into it? And don't get me wrong, Bioshock's good ending isn't great either, but at least it does its job. This way of integrating multiple endings into a game is actually very common, and for the sake of simplicity let's call it the punishment model. An example of another critically acclaimed game that uses this model would be The Witcher 3. Yes, I'm talking about The Witcher again, this time in a slightly more negative light. If you want Ciri to live, which unequivocally is your objective the whole game, you have to choose 3 out of 5 of these vague and nondescript dialogue choices. You may want to take pressure off of her by saying that there's no need to be good at everything when she feels frustrated instead of this dialogue option that you have no idea what it's about, and you may want her to try to calm down and think clearly instead of destroying the lair of an ancient elf, and thirdly, you may want to accompany Ciri to this important and dangerous meeting to ensure her safety and offer support. But if you pick these 3 dialogue choices, the game will think that you're a bad parent and you will get an ending where Ciri will die. But to me that seems like an oddly harsh punishment for some dialogue choices that are too vague or misleading. Does this seriously look like a dialogue choice that should score you a point in the Ciri will die meter? I don't mention the other 2 remaining choices because those should score points. And by the way, I'm not making the argument that Ciri has to live at the end just because it's the main objective. A game can have a satisfying conclusion without accomplishing its main objective if it builds up to it. I'm just saying it's weird that these very innocent choices a player could make can give you the bad ending. I'm sure it has happened to someone. But this model can also be implemented in a slightly better way, for example in Dishonored. In Dishonored, your choices visibly change the state of the world. If you kill a lot of people in one level, the plague will spread and you will encounter more infected, more enemies and more guards in the next one. That's a good punishment. There's a clear logic that the player can understand and see instantly, both in the gameplay and in the world. But most importantly, they can also reverse this bad ending state by killing less enemies. It's not permanent. The game is communicating clearly with the player and saying, this is the challenge, if you want a good ending you are going to have to kill less people. That makes the game harder and forces the player to interact with all of the tools the game gives them. It is still a punishment for playing a certain way, and the bad ending, if you get it, is bad, but at least there's warnings, choices, reasons that the player understands clearly, unlike with the previous 2 games. Now, as you see, this model has clear issues. I don't think it's effective at encouraging replayability, it's very outdated, and as I said before, it limits the bad ending to exist just as a punishment. Games have been around for a long time, we can surely do better, right? Yeah, I think so. So what's the alternative? Well, the solution isn't new. Developers just have to treat the bad ending as valid. RPGs have been doing this for a long while. When I say valid, I mean having the game itself accept it and embrace it as a genuine choice, not giving it less attention than a good ending, including in the narrative. In what is considered a classic good ending, the hero will save the world, defeat the villain, complete their objective, survive, maybe someone will sacrifice themselves, all that good stuff. But recently I played 2 games where even though the game gives me the choice to fulfill these principles at the end, not doing it felt just as right, or even better. Of course you have to blur the lines between good and evil a bit to make it work, but if you had to point towards the good ending in each of them, I ended up choosing another option. One of these games is an RPG, but the other is a single-player linear first-person shooter, so that proves that it can be done in most genres. The RPG is in the thumbnail, it's Dark Souls 3. I'm talking about the third one specifically because it's the one with the most interesting differences in the endings. I prefer to keep the plot retelling in my videos to a minimum, so here's me trying to explain Dark Souls as fast as possible. Dark Souls takes place in a fantasy world where at the beginning of time there was nothing but a stone world with no concept of the passage of time. Then out of nowhere a fire started and suddenly there was lights and shadows and souls and things were alive. An unimaginable amount of time passed and that original fire began to fade, threatening to return the world to nothingness. Living things began to lose their sentience and mortality, and time stopped moving in just one direction. The leader of the gods, who had the most powerful soul, sacrificed himself to the fire to fuel it and keep it going for more centuries or millennia or eons, no one knows really. In Dark Souls 1 you are supposed to be his successor, someone who will collect the most powerful souls in the world to offer to the fire to keep it alive. Ages go past, Dark Souls 2 plays out in a similar way, and then you reach Dark Souls 3 in the distant future. The world is tired, the fire has been kept alive artificially for no one knows how long. Everything is backwards, time and space don't function at all, and there's almost no power left in the world to throw to the fire. You play as someone who was cast into the fire just out of desperation. You didn't have any power, maybe you contributed like just one more second of lifetime to it, but still you survived because you are immortal, and your purpose is to absorb powerful souls, to sacrifice yourself at the end and keep the fire going. The choice at the end, now that you have absorbed a lot of powerful souls, is whether you will throw yourself to the fire or not. This doesn't really matter in Dark Souls 1 and 2 because the point is that even if you didn't throw yourself to the fire, someone else eventually did. But Dark Souls 3 is different because this is the end, you have the final choice. The world is ending for good this time, no one will come to save it if you don't. And different characters have their own viewpoints on what you should do. Some tell you to use the remaining power of the fire to rule the world for as long as it lasts, some tell you that there's no point, reality is suffering and scream for you to let it finally die, that we are going against the nature of the world, and some tell you that you have to feed the fire, that as long as there's hope, we have to keep going. The situation is bleak, there's no villain to defeat save for the irreversible nature of the world, but you can still technically save it for a bit longer. You can hold on to hope, and you can accomplish the goal you were given. These are supposed to be all the things the player wants, and yet it doesn't feel right. With every second the world becomes more twisted and there's more suffering. People know Dark Souls is all about not giving up, about conquering every challenge the game throws at you. The idea of determination is deeply engraved in its philosophy since the first game, but one underrated aspect of Dark Souls 3 is how it adds to this message by incorporating the idea of acceptance and making a distinction between the two. Sometimes one has to accept reality for what it is, and part of that is that all things must pass. It makes you question that maybe it is time to let things end, that maybe all the harm done in the name of keeping the fire alive is not worth the extra seconds of false hope it will grant. Is the world you have seen in the journey one that has humanity standing up proudly until the end of the fight, or is it an ever-growing grotesque mass of atrocities? You can quietly sacrifice yourself as the tiny flame tries to consume you, or you can choose to put out the fire and that's the end. The world turns to black as you hear the voice of your companion, the firekeeper, saying that in the future she can see tiny embers of the fire, and it is said that one day from those embers a new fire will emerge, bringing a new beginning, just like what happened at the beginning of time. It is only after accepting the inevitable that this new opportunity appears. Acceptance is the final teaching in the trilogy and, in my opinion, its natural conclusion, a conclusion that can only be provided by the less hopeful ending. The second game that surprised me at the end is Spec Ops The Line. This is a game I avoided for several years because I already knew about the white phosphorus scene. a moment that is still, unfortunately, causing controversy on Twitter more than a decade after the game's release. And I thought it was just that, a game depicting the atrocities of modern-day imperialism, with the climax of the game revealing that you just war-crimed a bunch of civilians. Oh no. That's a lesson that was necessary and mature for an industry that was dominated by Call of Duty and Battlefield at the time, but nonetheless a lesson that didn't seem too interesting to me because there never was a time when I disagreed with it. But I was wrong, because the white phosphorus scene is just that, one scene in the middle of the game, nowhere near the climax. In Spec Ops, you play as the captain of a Spec Ops unit tasked with going to a desert storm-ravaged Dubai to find and evacuate any survivors, including a US Army battalion that deserted to help with the evacuation of the city. It is important to say that you play as someone with good intentions. Your objective is truly to help any survivors. But that's not easy when the entire city is engulfed in a civil war for the food, water and resources between several factions of both the locals and the US Army battalion that tried to help the city after it fell. You've lost communication with your superiors, and every hostile group in the city thinks that you belong to another hostile group, so you end up having to defend yourself. The more you progress through the game, the more harm you end up doing to everyone, like when you shoot the white phosphorus into a civilian camp because the soldiers that administered the camp were about to kill you. The game does an amazing job of portraying this hopeless downward spiral of unwittingly doing the worst of things while you repeat to yourself that you just wanted to help people. How could it be your fault? And yet you also know it undeniably is your fault. My favorite part is when you finally find an ally in the city who turns out to be a CIA operative, and when you end up obeying an agent of the CIA, you know you're about to enter the WatchMojo Top 10 Worst War Criminals in History list. But it works because finally you have someone who seems to know what is going on and what needs to be done for the good of the city. That's when you help him raid one of the main camps of the army battalion, and boom, there goes the entire water reserves of the city. You have just doomed everybody there to die of dehydration. That was the mission of the CIA because they didn't want the US to have to take the blame for the actions of the deserted army battalion, and there's no one who can blame them for anything if everybody's dead. Thankfully, you can choose to not put him out of his misery when he goes up in flames. But after doing all that and suffering constant hallucinations from the waning sanity of your PTSD-affected mind, what are you even supposed to do in the end? You're alone and you have finally found a radio you can call a rescue team with. From there are 4 possible outcomes. In the first one, you hold out for several days until a rescue team comes to get you. You surrender your weapons and you leave Dubai. Once your communications were cut off, your mission was to find a way to get extracted, so mission accomplished, you managed to survive and return home. Congratulations, you got the good ending. Technically. But this is also the least conclusive ending because it doesn't answer the questions of what kind of life awaits you after all that. How do you deal with the weight of the death of an entire city? Endings 2 and 3 involve you succumbing to your PTSD and shooting the rescue team on sight, and you can either survive or get killed in the encounter. These two I find more compelling because I don't see how this man could react in any other way after what he has been through. He came into the city trying to save these people consumed by the horrors of war, so it makes sense that in the end he becomes just one more of them. And the final ending involves you not calling for a rescue team at all. You just shoot yourself, because you know that the burden you carry is simply too heavy, almost to an objective degree. It seems pretty hard that someone could deal with that, as well as with the fact that you could snap and kill someone anytime. So you decide to die with the last piece of dignity you have left as you see the burning corpse of the city you just killed. That's the one I chose because I thought it was the most merciful one for him. Once again, the situation is bleak, but if you had to identify the good ending, it would be the one where you return home. And that's just the one that is least tied to the themes of the game in my opinion. If anything, this is a game that pushes you to not pick the good ending while also treating it as a valid conclusion. Needless to say, when done correctly, the interactivity of video games leading to a player being capable of choosing their own path is one of the great advantages of the medium against all others. I think we can all agree that choose your own adventure books or interactive films are nowhere near in that regard. And yet there is still one flaw the medium can seem to get rid of, and that is the fact that unless they are standalone games or the final game of a franchise, video game sequels actively find ways to nullify the impacts of your choices. For example, The Witcher 3 barely takes into account what happens in The Witcher 2, Dishonored 2 arbitrarily chooses what your character did in the first one, Telltale Games, well, you know, and a lot of RPGs like the Divinity series or Deus Ex intentionally set their games in different ages to avoid having to undertake the obviously expensive and time-consuming challenge of making a sequel that takes into account the mix of hundreds of choices you made in the previous game. That is one of the limitations of the medium, but who knows, maybe in the not so distant future, AI will change that. Not saying that's a good or bad thing, just saying that's where it seems to be going. In the meantime, we can also appreciate games like Undertale that through sheer creativity and fourth wall breaking managed to make not only both of its opposing endings canon, but also the concept of replaying the game as well, with characters reacting to what you did in your previous playthrough. If you choose to get the bad ending, the world is destroyed in the end, and you, the person playing the game, are asked to give up your soul to restore it and be able to play it again. This will also alter the next ending you get, which will be slightly different now that you don't have a soul, even if you choose the same ending again. Obviously not every game has to get meta to have good multiple endings, but it is worth mentioning how Undertale escapes all limitations of the medium. So that's it, not the most original topic, but I wanted to talk about why I like these two endings in particular. To conclude all the thoughts, I think that there was this idea from 2007 to around 2015 that having multiple endings was like a step forward in the industry, so every game had to have that feature. Something similar happened with motion control mechanics around that time too. But if you see what most AAA games are coming out nowadays, very few actually have multiple endings. And that isn't bad because it means that they are not wasting time and money into a mechanic they didn't really want. And then you know that the games that do have multiple endings actually put effort into it and don't make the common mistakes games from the past usually made. That's all for today, have a good one.